But as we look at the story of Daniel, we say it, it's the story. We hear these things. We're in the middle of one of the most famous ones of all time. It's those three guys who get thrown in the fire. We obviously know what happens. So I'm going to start off a little bit like bathroom humor and then get serious and then get a little convicting, but we're going to end on God's grace. So no matter what happens, I promise we're going to end really, really well. But first, I want to talk specifically to guys and gross out the other half of the audience, and I'm sorry. So guys, how many of you have ever gone to a camp and you had the guy leader where you're like, that should have been my dad. He's the coolest guy ever. Like, your dad's great, but then you meet this other guy and you're like, oh, this is the manliest man I've ever met. And so there was this guy named Mark. He was fantastic. I was at high school camp, this massive camp out in California, and he brought stuff that definitely should have gotten us kicked out of camp. And so like various points, like he brought screwdrivers and like those old school like bell ringing alarm clocks so we could go into other guys' cabins and set the alarms at various times. But the screwdrivers were so we could get into the air vents. So like the bells would go off and they would have no access to turn these things off. But he brought a ton of wacky stuff that definitely should have gotten us in trouble. But he's so awesome we never did. But my favorite moment of the entire camp, it was disgusting and fantastic. He brought a couple lighters so we could light our farts on fire. It works. If you've ever done it, you can raise your hand so I know I'm not alone. Am I the only freak in the room? All right, no one's admitting to it. I'm the only freak in the room. So anyway, we have a cabin of guys. There's about like 13 or 14 of us lighting our farts on fire. And I promise it has something to do with the Bible. I promise I'm getting there. But when lighting our fart on fire, it works. It sounds like a made-up thing from the movies, but it works. And so we all were just farting. It was lighting up. It literally is a blue flame. It does eliminate the smell. But this one kid, I want to say his name was Travis, but I could be wrong. I think it's this guy named Travis. He was like the craziest kid at camp. And this was a camp of hundreds of people, and our church brought like 100 themselves. But like he was the craziest one, and he was in our cabin. So he decides to like, oh, I'm not going to do this for my body. I'm just going to bare butt light it on fire. And we're like, I might catch on fire. The fire might go inside of me, destroy me. But he just goes for it. And then we start smelling burnt human hair. How many of you have ever smelled burnt human hair? That is one of the nastiest, rankest, like farts are nothing in comparison to the smell of burnt hair. And so that's where we're like, okay, that was hilarious. That was majestic. I think we're done. Let's open a window. Like it's not fun anymore. Because if a cabin of guys at camp thinks it smells bad, like that's a level beyond what normal human smell should ever experience. And so I'm intentionally putting this terrible thought picture in all of your minds is because some people get burnt alive in a fire and we're just like, oh, that's part of the story. It would smell terrible. Not only would it be horrifying to watch people being burnt alive, it would smell disgusting. And so part of why I'm being this nasty and gross on purpose, aside from being funny, is I want us to get the idea in our heads when we look at the Bible, I'll pick on me. I have this bad habit, maybe you do too, but if you're reading a history textbook or you're reading the Bible, that's kind of how we're trained to read stuff. It's just this historical account, and unless it's in the book, we don't really bother imagining what it would have been like. But for real, some people are about to get burnt alive. It would smell disgusting. It would be horrific to see. But we know what's going to happen, and we know that it's going to be fine. And so we just kind of keep going along in the story. And so this morning we're going to repeat a couple verses from last week because we're finishing out chapter 3 and see what we can learn, because at the end of the day, it's what we said last week. We're not going to have to worry in our lifetime about someone going and saying, I am the king leader of this country, and building a massive statue unless you go bow to them. We're expecting that sometime in the future, because if you were in D groups and you read 1 Thessalonians, it talks about the end of things at the end of chapter 1. Even one of our students was like, wait a minute, Jesus coming back and there's wrath to come? That's weird and uncomfortable. But the thing is, in Daniel, we're going to cover all of that, even why in a verse we're looking at, Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And it sounds very good, but at the end of the day, there's some detail we need to take with our brains and our imaginative power and put into the story, or else we're just repeating it and we're looking at the flannel graph, which dates me a little bit. Now we have videos. Back in the day, it was put the little flannel characters on the board and peel them off. So, but in this, we're going to look at a story we've heard a ton in a situation we likely will never experience ourselves. So let's look at Daniel chapter 3. Because last week, we finished verses 1 through 16, but 1 through 18, but we're going to start back in verse, I want to say 16, I think is what I put up on the slide. We'll see. Yep, 16. But within all of this, these men who have now aged, they're probably in their mid-30s with wives and children and families because they've obeyed what God called them to. Last week we said that despite the lies of our day and every day to come, we are called to consider the cost and decide if we will glorify God. And that's exactly what these three men do. As we read last week, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." And Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. How many of you have been in trouble with your dad to the point where his face got distorted with rage? Or your mom, like your mom has that look, you know you're about to die because you did that thing at the grocery store she told you not to do 257 times. The 258th time your mom finally lost her cool. It's worse than that because this is a crazy man. Nebuchadnezzar was the leader of one of the greatest civilizations the planet had ever seen, especially at that moment, but he was a maniacal, crazy man. And so his face is distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So back to that nasty lighting farts on fire story. That smell would have been horrific. Seeing people burn to death would have been horrific. I took AP history class in high school and then failed the AP history test, so it didn't help me at all. But my professor was like, "You're the more smarter, mature students of the school, so I'm going to just show you wacky stuff." And so apparently in South Africa, time in apartheid history, things got very violent and terrible for people, and we're watching a dramatization of some of the violence that occurred between people, and I got to watch what actually happened, but it was a reenactment. But they would put tires around someone's waist and shoot out their kneecaps and light them on fire and watch them run around. Horrific torture. Yeah, if you're shocked right now, I did that on purpose because it was shocking for me too. My parents were like, "They showed you what at school? This was a private Christian school. They shouldn't show you those kind of things." But it stuck with me because seeing something so horrifically violent should shock us. But we've heard the Sunday school story. Oh yeah, the guards died, but God's good, so let's all go home and high five. No, this would have been horrific to see. Because these men died, the fire was so hot, it would have smelled terrible. But the story goes on. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. And our big idea this week is, regardless of how others respond, the only way to be rescued is through the incomparable power of Christ. And that's the easiest one of all time. You're like, "No, duh, that's why we go to church, Matt." But getting to this point in the story, they're really faithful to God, and that is their only defense. When the king calls them forward, he gives them an opportunity, and they say, "We don't need to defend ourselves because God is the one who's going to decide whether we live or die." And we already know how this ends. The story ends really, really happily. But my first point within these first couple of verses, faithfulness to God is our only defense. I'm going to pick on all of us because at the end of the day, if you're like me, you have other defenses you kind of put out before that on why you're right and why what you're doing is a good thing. And on the way you're living your life, we kind of build up these ideas in our heads. And we say, "Hey, my defense is, in my defense, I love you," is my catchphrase if it was a bad sitcom at my house. Anytime I do something really, really stupid, and my wife looks at me like, what were you thinking? And I look at her like, "In my defense, I love you." And it's kind of, you chuckle. She chuckles and still wants to murder me. If I die of rat poison, please call the police. It was my wife. But she chuckles and laughs at it. But I have a defense before that. But at the end of the day, if we believe the gospel's true, it doesn't matter how much money is in our 401k. It doesn't matter what we've planned out for our lives and our future. If faithfulness to God is our only defense, the stuff we deal with is going to look very different. Because our bigger problem this morning isn't that you've heard this passage over and over again. It's that most likely, for the rest of your life, no one's going to come to you and kill you if you say you believe in God. It's probably not going to happen. You become a missionary, go to another country, hey, guess what? Might happen on a regular basis. But in the United States of America, our defenses get really built up around comfort of our own lives. So as we keep reading in the story, we know where it's going. We know what's going to happen. So we're just going to keep doing it. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" He had some guys fall over dead, burnt. There's steaming, charred corpses in front of their view. And he's like, "What? Is it just the smoke, or is there actually another guy in there?" And so he says, look, I see 4 men. They say, yes, your majesty, we certainly did. They replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Yours might say like a messenger of God, something along those lines. Would you be if you're angrily murdering someone, just imagine if you've ever been driving down the freeway and someone from Florida driving like they're off to like escape a murder or commit a murder in one direction or the other. Anyone driving in Florida plates, they just scare me on 24. I've barely seen one going the speed limit my entire time in Tennessee. But just seeing that guy, they're in a rush, they're hurrying. He's like, these guys are hanging out in the fire. So he's shocked and in disbelief that someone is walking around hanging out in the fire. It's a smoldering mess that's horrifying people. He's like, didn't we throw in 3 guys? Why are they hanging out? They're not even tied up anymore, and they're just hanging out. And then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. No duh, we're at the flannel graph point. We're on track. And so I'm going to make a second point that if you're like me, you have some objections to. But our second point this morning is we are invincible until God chooses our homecoming. Think about that for a second. These people faithfully followed God. There was tons of other people in captivity from Israel and Judah in Babylon, and all of them shut up, bowed down, and worshiped a false god. But God still had plans for them, as we know from Jeremiah. God still loved them and cared for them, but 3 men decided, hey, whether we live or die doesn't really matter. We're going to obey God. We do have death. We have disease. We have people in our lives that are hurting and suffering. But I want to remind each and every one of us this morning that in faithfulness to God as our only defense, you are completely invincible until God chooses when you're going home. There's nothing that can happen to you that God is not in control of and knows what is going to happen. And this is a very positive thing to think about, but if you're like me, the doubt instantly questions and says, well, if God really loves me, why did I deal with this illness? Why did my family member get sick and die? Why did I lose people? And the answer is, God allowed it to happen. And if that's frustrating and that angers you, and there's things here, I promise we're getting to a point with what we're saying. But in the meantime, every single one of us is invincible until God chooses our homecoming. There's plenty of ways we can choose to be useless to God, but in their faithfulness, they were untouchable, and they were with someone. I lean towards it being an angel, because Jesus had not physically come in the flesh yet. But anytime people see things around them and think, man, I need something other than faithfulness in God as my only defense, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, we run into a problem, and we're going to get to what Jesus says about that by the end of this. Because Jesus says something, and if you're probably thinking of it already, but he says something about saving your life. But then I want to highlight one thing here. We always love saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were untouched by the flames. God brought them out. We should all say no duh. I brought this up about a year ago when we preached through earlier in the passage, and I left out their names intentionally for this sermon. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you knew those names and you tell that as the bedtime story to your children, fantastic, but their names were something else. These were their new names. Their old names when they were born in Judah by their parents who loved God, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and I had to write that down because I also only memorized Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the culture around them renamed them, gave them a new identity, but I think they knew who they were the whole time and who God was because their names mean something, and it all adds up in this story. Hananiah means God is gracious. Mishael means who is like God. And Azariah means God has helped. Did God help them? Nebuchadnezzar is about to tell us no one is like their God, and Mishael's name means who is like God. And his name, Hananiah, means God is gracious. Were all 3 of these men failed sinners who didn't have Jesus? Yes. Do they deserve to die and be separated from God for all eternity? Also, yes. But God not only saves them for all eternity through the future work of Jesus Christ, but he graciously saves them in that moment. So all three of their names explain exactly what happens in this story. And then we read the next part and we praise God and we go home. Except we're not going to do that this morning. So then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Because what got burned away? Nothing, right? The answer is something did get burned away. The only thing that burned away was the human attempts at restraining the followers of God. That's not one of our points, but I want that to be memorable. They were tied up with the strongest people they could find in the army. Several of those army people burnt up to a crisp and smelled terrible and were lying as rotting corpses on the floor as these three people walked through the fire completely unbound and unscathed. And we sing songs about chains breaking and addictions coming free, and those are all true. But I want to highlight that no matter what is done to you, God is more powerful than that. That can get us into a sermon on forgiveness for another time, but we're going to put a peg in that one because that's not what this passage is about. But the only thing that burned away were the human attempts at restraining the followers of God. That's why no matter how much across this planet people actually get persecuted, attacked, killed, destroyed, mutilated, tortured, everything we've seen across human history, followers of Jesus always seem to replicate at a much faster rate that the persecution can kill them. Because God's power is beyond anything that can happen to us. So as we said, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree: if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." And Mishael said, "You think? Because that's my name, and you threw me in the fire. You've arrived at the conclusion my parents had when they named me. There is no other God like the God." And so we say, hey, that's a great moment that Nebuchadnezzar recognizes it. And then the king promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. So they get promotions, they have better jobs, they can better provide for their families. And we pat ourselves on the back saying, hey, Nebuchadnezzar realized who God was, and we all say, great. Fortunately, that's not the point of the end of this chapter. The point at the end of this chapter is Nebuchadnezzar still will not repent and follow God. It takes the next chapter, and it's a whole lot of stuff. There's more dreams. There's more prophecy. It involves him running around outdoors pretending he's an animal for a long period of time. Some people argue that's actually where we get the mythos of werewolves, because it's an ancient account of someone living like a beast in the fields, thinking they're an animal. Because Nebuchadnezzar has repeatedly seen God work, and he's like, he's powerful. Not going to follow him, but man, he's in charge of something. And so our third point this morning is, some people will repeatedly recognize God's power, yet still not submit to him. And that's a bummer. Because I'm sure you've met people that have seen God do incredible things, transforming human lives, miraculously saving people out of certain death, and all of these things, and they're like, well, there's a God somewhere, but I'm not so sure about it. I'm finishing up a book right now about science versus religion, and part of the point of the book is it's actually not at war. And there's the more we discover of even the human genome and computer programming and coding, the more we're like, it really seems like somebody made all of this. Because the monkeys with a typewriter theory doesn't really pan out, because the universe, even if it's as old as some people theorize, would need about 10 gajillion, I'm not good at math, so I don't remember the actual math term, but the actual time monkeys in a typewriter taking to make everything we see is impossible. And it leaves us with the question of why people will still see that God is who he says he is, see his power, and still not follow him. Because that's the danger we all face. If you've become a follower of Jesus, it is clear you cannot lose your salvation. You are in his hands because God has given you over into the hands of Christ. And Christ is gentle and lowly of heart, and he will never leave you and never forsake you. And that's really good news. But as we're looking at this story, we see that the faithfulness to God is supposed to be our only defense. We can see that we actually are invincible until God chooses our time of homecoming. And some people repeatedly recognize God's power and refuse to submit to it. So what do we do with that in light of the gospel? Because this story is not new information. You've probably heard a sermon where they explain that the names mean these things. We see the only thing that was burnt away was the things trying to bind them. And we see that God sent one of his messengers. It's probably one of the angels that talks to Daniel later. But we have to look at something Jesus said, because on that second point, we're invincible until God chooses our homecoming, and faithfulness to God is our only defense. If we look, we're going to put it on the screen so you don't have to flip frantically, but at Luke chapter 9 is what we're going to look at as we end this morning. And there's only a couple of verses from Luke chapter 9, but I want to highlight a couple weird things, because similar to me needing to tell a wacky story about burning farts to get you in the mindset of this would be a horrific event, watching people thrown into a furnace and the guards themselves being burnt alive, we can just take, oh, there's a verse and Jesus said something. That's great. But in context, Jesus says in Luke 23, or chapter 9, verse 23, Luke 9 is really early in the story. Was Jesus crucified yet? No. He's chapters and chapters away from ever dying on a cross. But Jesus, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Is that what happened with these three men? Did they willingly go to die for the sake of obeying God? 100%. And guess what? They were saved. But you and I live in the knowledge and reality now. There are some people that are killed for their faith. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. That means that Jesus is who he says he is. He is completely sovereign. And I think in light of this passage, though, there's a challenge for all of us. Because if you're to deny yourself daily, take up your cross and follow him, do we do that? We are not going to live through what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived through. You are not going to have this life where it's going to come down to a single moment of standing up in that moment, and then for the rest of your life you get promoted and everything just kind of goes the right way. I think it was Tozer, it might be somebody else, but the idea is the hardest part of the Christian life is it's so constant. Whether you're a janitor, a CEO, a stay-at-home mom, a kid in elementary school, someone struggling through middle school and high school because that was designed by science to torture all of us. Whatever you're dealing with in life, those realities are important and they matter. Because tomorrow and the day after that, you're going to keep waking up to that reality until Christ comes back. But even in reflecting on the book of Daniel, the author that wrote a book I studied a lot for this, John C. Lennox, he pointed out that we think this is it. Everybody around you, we live on matter. We know gravity is a thing. We can live our lives firmly. We can know that God set the earth on its pillars and it shall not be moved. So if you build a house in Tennessee, unless a tornado comes by, you're probably going to be okay. Your house is going to be there when you get home. But what's crazy to think is if God is 100% spirit, all the material world, everything we have, everything we see and touch and experience is a secondary creation. The spiritual world was all that existed until God created the physical, real world. And you can debate a scientist till you're blue in the face, but at the end of the day, the Greeks had it right, and we haven't thought of a better series of ideas since then. You either have eternal matter or an eternal creator. One of those two things has to be true, and if there is someone who came to this planet, died on the cross, and came back to life and canceled every funeral he attended, we should probably take seriously the fact there might actually be a rather simple explanation. That something created everything, that something revealed himself and his character through his word, correctly predicted hundreds of years of human history in the book of Daniel, and through these stories we learned in Sunday school, he's calling us to live differently. Well, we're going to wake up tomorrow. There's bills to pay, jobs to work, schools to go to, chores to do. Right now it's not raining very much, so you don't have the lawn to mow, but aside from that, you have a lot to get doing. But Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And that would be really weird hearing from someone who hadn't died on a cross. But in Luke chapter 9, Jesus was nowhere near the cross yet. And his disciples were like, that was odd. But if you're going to deny yourself, who do you deny if you're a follower of Christ and you don't deny yourself? You deny Christ. And that can freak us out a lot. Because if you sung that song, Run to the Father, or you're a good, good father, or if you're like me and you're like, hey, my dad wasn't perfect. Everyone in this room had an imperfect dad. some of them better than others. But if the God of the Bible is the Father who's revealed to be good and true and right and just and is bringing about everything that we long for in our hearts, and when I say we, I mean humanity. Everything Daniel is going to prophesy that Jesus is going to fulfill when he comes again, every human heart longs for that. But if we don't deny ourselves, who are we denying? Jesus. And so I want to encourage all of us this morning that you may have done what I've done this week. You haven't denied yourself, you haven't taken up your cross, and you haven't followed Jesus on a daily basis. Because we can get distracted by the things around us because the daily life is so constant. And so I want to point out the worst Christian in the Bible, Peter, because he's really easy to pick on because he did it himself for all of us. But who bragged the most about never denying Jesus for not a single second, no matter what happened, and he whipped out a sword and had terrible aim and chopped off a guy's ear instead of his neck? Peter. And then he denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times. Third time's the charm. I don't know if that's where we got it from, but that's when the rooster crowed. Do you think he felt really full of guilt and shame, remembering back to when Jesus told him, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me, as he knows Jesus is heading for the cross, and he just denied Jesus repeatedly? And I'm not bringing that up to make us feel guilty and shameful. I'm bringing it up to show God's grace. Because Peter didn't just get zapped by a lightning bolt and die. He went on to actually write some of the New Testament. He went on to continue to be foolish in certain moments. Paul had to publicly confront him about some public ministry where he was denying the gospel with his daily life again. There's a 4th time he was living out in denial of Jesus with his own action. But he wrote something fascinating in 1 Peter. I'm not going to put it on the screen, I'm just going to reference it. But he says, if you make a practice of sinning, you have no part of being in Christ. Because if you're like me, you've sinned this week, hopefully unintentionally. But if that man who denied Jesus multiple times, 3 times in a row, 1 time later, he probably did on accident at least once a week, because that's what most of us do. But if Jesus has told us, those who wish to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it, he's pointing us to right now here on earth, if our focus is anything but him, our focus is off. And he says at the end of the day, you're not going to gain anything in the long term, so what's the point if you lose your own life? And then he brings about what's coming at the end, which gets brought up in our D groups in 1 Thessalonians. It gets brought up in Daniel as the story continues. It's all intertwined because we need the full context of Scripture from Daniel to Christ through the end of everything in the Bible to understand the world around us. But if Jesus told Peter, guess what, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter did it anyway. Does that mean God already knew what sins you were going to commit? Yes. God knew every sin you were ever going to commit and will commit for the rest of your life. He still got up on the cross and died for you because he loves you that much. I was a terrible dad, and that's where my stories will remain. They will not be stories about what my daughter did wrong. It'll be me being a terrible dad. I think day 5 of bringing my daughter home from the hospital, I'm not getting any sleep for obvious reasons. I'm trying to change her diaper or feed her or something at like 5 a.m., and she's making sounds because she's a 5, 6-day-old baby, however old she was at the time. And Caitlin wakes up to me going, meh, meh, meh. And she's like, are you mocking our child? And I was like, well, didn't mean to be, but yes. Because out of exhaustion and frustration, I'm already tired 6 days in. But God will never do that to any of us. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah have no more story in this book. They don't go on to do incredible things in service to God. They just said, hey, whether or not you kill us, we're following the God that brought us here because we love and trust him, and God worked and he was glorified. That's all we have to do. And when we fall short of that, like we know we will, God, Father, is not me towards my kid. God will never mock you and laugh at you when you come to him and say you failed. Because when Peter goes on to say, those that make a practice of sinning are no longer a part of God's family, he's not saying, hey, if you've sinned the same sin once a week, for a year, guess what? You're going to hell. I saw a clip of an interview with Jenna Ortega talking about a fencing instructor she had for one of her TV shows or movies. And she was like, yeah, my coach was actually pretty upset and was like, I wish I had gotten a hold of you when you were 10 because you could have gone to the Olympics. Because in the United States, we're broken like many other countries. We find a child that's like 4, and we're like, you're going to pole vault. And then we train them until their kneecaps break at like 32 and tell them, good job, you brought glory to the United States. But they wanted to train her for years to see her full potential realized. And that's what Peter's point is. We're all going to deny Jesus, but if you make a practice of doing things that he calls you to not do, then you're in trouble. You've gone pro. You've made your whole identity nothing to do with Christ and everything to do with your own sin. So if we believe this is true, that faithfulness to God is our only defense, that's really comforting. And we're not going to take a moment to turn to the person next to you and say the worst thing you ever did. But in the relationships you make at this church with other believers across your life, there should be a common ground. When you go spend time with other believers that get who God is and recognize that faithfulness in God's truth is the only thing that matters, it doesn't matter what the worst thing you've ever done is. Whether you've killed someone or gotten a parking ticket, all have fallen short of the glory of God. Whether you've lied to your mom, cheated on your grades, lied about your taxes, guess what? God's grace is still sufficient. And if we're truly invincible until God chooses our homecoming, we don't really have to worry about a lot. The only thing I'll encourage us to worry about is, are we helping raise up a community of children? And this isn't a tie into helping kids ministry. I mean, this is a community of believers. There's no teenagers in the room, so I can say it fully without ruining the spoiler alert. So I don't say this in front of teenagers, but for all of us, if we believe we're invincible until God's homecoming, we can focus this a little bit more on just the kids we have. Because there's a lot of really awesome small humans, and they're growing. But here's the secret that I've learned from years of seeing what youth ministry works and doesn't work. If 5 of you in this room know one kid, and guess what? You have enough brain cells to remember more than one kid's name. You don't have to go serve immediately in kids ministry, but if you recognize that the stories they're learning are true, they teach the truth that is only available through God and his word. If 5 of you just say, hey, Hudson, I'll pick on Hudson because he's always around. Hudson, if 5 of you know Hudson's name and just say, hey, I heard you did great in your soccer game this week, and that's the entirety of you talking to him that week, and there's 5 different people that aren't his mom and dad and me, Hudson is over 200% more likely when he graduates high school, chooses where to go off to college, he's either going to keep going to this church or wherever he moves, he will find another church because he realizes church is about not just his mom and dad and his pastor, but a group of believers that know him, love him, and are helping raise him in the faith. And that works for every student, including Baker and everybody. Because the more we see God in a community together, the more we're going to love him. That's part of the acoustic focus. But do you think it's possible that this was a very public attempt at an execution with Nebuchadnezzar throwing people into a giant fiery furnace? Yeah. He wanted everybody to see, and we know as a fact there wasn't just 4 people brought from Judah. There was plenty of people from Israel, there were plenty of people from Judah, and they all kept their mouths shut and bowed down. And they saw 3 people say, nah, Yahweh, that God that we worship, he's the only one, and nothing you can do is going to matter. You think they regretted not standing up and saying, hey, throw me in too? That'd be pretty embarrassing. You're like, oh, maybe my parents were right. Maybe my rabbi and my priest back in my hometown, maybe they weren't a bunch of old idiots because they saw God's power work, and then, bummer, I could have stepped up and been a part of that. And that's my heart for all of us, is the more we see the context, it's not that we hear Jesus say the words that if you don't deny yourself, you don't follow after me, and whoever wishes to save his own life will lose it, but if you don't behave the right way, God's coming after you. God already came after us in the form of his Son, and it's to save us and redeem us and give us freedom. But again, some of us might be Nebuchadnezzar, and that's what we're going to focus on for the next 2 weeks. Some of us have repeatedly recognized God's power and still won't submit to him. Some of us have repeatedly seen God's power, and we're like, hey, that one part of my life, that's off limits. I know better. There's that old slogan I haven't seen in forever. Thank goodness we might have beaten it. How many of you seen the bumper sticker or the t-shirts like God is my co-pilot on it? You're in the plane with God, the creator of everything, and you want to fly the plane? If I'm jumping out of an airplane, pray for me because Curtis talked me into it. But God is my co-pilot. Interesting life choice. The creator of everything, who's beyond space and time, who gave us the ground that we walk on, the world to live in, the beauty of science, pursuing knowledge and understanding so that we can call each other from across the planet. And as the poet Brad Paisley once pointed out, it's pretty good to be alive right now because soldiers can talk with their families from Afghanistan. There's plenty of beautiful things God has blessed us with and given us, but we got really comfortable in a world and a culture that's not out to get us, and no one's coming to kill us, but we might have gotten a little bit okay with the Nebuchadnezzars, who have repeatedly seen that God has, he's got something, but they're not sure it's worth it. So my encouragement for us this morning, and our big idea again, is regardless of how others respond, the only way to be rescued is through the incomparable power of Christ. And you say no, duh, Matt, that's why we go to church. If you're saying no, duh, with me this morning, that's great. I don't know you personally enough to ask this question, so just for yourself, ask it. Your one life, have you figured out a person in your life you can actually be talking to and helping understand this truth? Because if this is true, are we living that way? This morning I was waiting to load up the trailer, and I got there a couple minutes early, but I knew Justin was going to be there soon, so I started doing things because I trusted Justin would be there soon. Everyone knows where this analogy is going, but that's daily life, and it's how it works. If we don't act in a way that show our beliefs are real, do we actually believe it's true? And the unfortunate answer is no. Because a lot of the Israelites and a lot of the Judeans, all originally from one tribe under King David, had seen the Psalms, seen the prophets, seen God do impressive miracles. Who had heard their grandparents and their grandparents before them talk of when God made the earth stand still and the sun and the moon paused in the sky. Who parted the waters of the Sea of Reeds. I know you think it's the Red Sea, nerd out for another time, but God continually intervened. And at the end of the day, they said, you know what? It doesn't seem like God actually knows what he's doing, and these really smart people over here have way bigger towns, way better stuff, and we're just going to shut up, sit down, and keep our heads down so we keep them on our shoulders. And since we live in the United States, I can promise you no one will come to harm you for having one person in your life that's just saying, hey, God is real, and I'm worried that you're either like the Israelites where you grew up in church and you might have just heard it and it sounded like a good idea, but then you're one of the 70% of high schoolers that just stopped going to church once you went off to college. Jesus is real. He is inevitably returning, and everything is getting renewed and restored in him, and he told us unless we seek to save our lives in him, we don't have a chance. And the good news is God's grace is sufficient. But my fear for all of us is we're going to wind up a lot more like the people of Israel and the people of Judah. They're just like, well, things aren't going my way right now, so I'm going to sit back and hope this doesn't happen. This is a very brief history note that I usually bring up about once a month. But look at the East Coast. What is the name of every hospital and college and public, like anything for the public good? Is there a church name or a saint's name or something attached to every beautiful old stone whatever on the East Coast? The answer is yes. Because Christians got to this point where like, man, we're actually running this place. Believe it or not, like we're making some mistakes that we're not aware of yet, but man, we're doing great. Let's start doing things that aren't going to even be within the church walls. Let's build hospitals. Let's build orphanages. Let's build all of these social goods out of obedience to God because our neighbors who don't know him still deserve good medical care, deserve all these great things. And then something happened over time where the culture said, hey, yeah, you guys are a little bit like hokey and outdated what you believe in, and we have better explanations now, so just shut up and kind of sit down. And we did. Collectively, we all pulled back from culture and said, they're rejecting us, so we're going to stop telling them anything. And right now, we have the temptation to do that again because neither politician running for government will claim to follow Jesus anymore. Before you had to, even if you didn't really, you had to get the Christian vote because there were so many Christians that cared. You had to at least pretend to get some of the Christian votes. Both candidates have publicly stated they are not believers in God. We are now at a point where no matter what you thought was growing up and normal is going to shift and change culturally. No one's going to come throw you in the fire. They may argue about the guns, and Tennesseans might fight back, and who the heck knows? But what I want us to have a hope and confidence in is if we don't stop engaging God to engage other people for his glory, we might all look back in the retirement home and say, hey, were we a lot more like the Israelites that just shut up and sat down when people challenged whether or not God was who he said he was? And some people are better at talking than others, but guess what? Introverts in the room, you like other people still. You just don't want to do it in a large group. Extroverts, you're already there. But it doesn't matter what kind of person you are. It doesn't matter what kind of life you've led, because if God is your only defense, it doesn't really matter if your neighbors find out your dirty laundry. It doesn't matter, as the saying goes, if a prayer request in Sunday school reveals all of your family's problems. Because if in a community of people that know God and know He paid the price so we don't have to, it doesn't matter. There's heartbreak that we're to be there for each other. We're supposed to weep with those who weep. And it's beautiful when it happens. But I can guarantee we live in a church culture in the United States in 2024 where we don't really like crying because that's what losers do. We don't really like losing because that's what losers do. It's in the name. So we just need to double down, shut up, sit down, and get through this. And then one day when things start going better, maybe we'll share our faith. So that's my hope for us this morning is, yes, we looked at the passage. We saw the story. No, duh, they lived. But let's not be the Israelites and the Judeans who sat back and like, man, we really missed the bus on that one. We could have been a people that all got thrown into the fire, and there's like, why is there a block party inside of the furnace? And the presence of a messenger of God, they had some kind of conversation we don't even know. But you, if you believe in God and you've repented and trust that His Son was sufficient for what you have done wrong and ever will do, guess what? You're going to spend time talking to angels, seeing spiritual beings. Every spooky thing from the X-Files is going to look like a wackadoodle sideshow in comparison because our God is that much bigger than our imagination. So my hope for us this morning is if someone in this room is more like Nebuchadnezzar and you're like, yeah, I've seen God do a lot of stuff, but it's not worth trusting. This is a moment, which you'll have many more of in your lifetime, to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I need to turn. And I don't think God is ever going to think, I haven't seen God do it twice where He tells someone that, hey, you're going to go live as a cow for a couple of years and you'll figure out that I'm God. But I have seen people repeatedly reject God and reject trusting in Him, reject obeying Him, and their life goes on this weird decline. And then we call it rock bottom, and then they're like, oh, and then I found God. God was like ready to be found the entire time. He was chasing them down. He wanted them to be there. And part of the beauty of the Christian message isn't that come to this church or come to this church in town. It doesn't matter what building you're in. It means collectively as God's people, we're going to be given God's glory. And if that's true, and we believe it, we're going to start saying things about it. We're going to start doing things that don't make sense. And I don't mean give away all your possessions to the poor. Guess what? Jesus commanded that of somebody, and they said, nah, I'm good. But Jesus did it because He loved them and saw that that was the one thing they refused to give up. Some people get blessed with fantastic work ethics, fantastic career opportunities, and they become CEOs. Back to the janitor and the CEO. If your entire job is cleaning houses or your entire job is running the Coca-Cola, whatever the name of the corporation is, you are equally important in God's eyes. So it doesn't matter who you are working with or next to, or whether they're the wealthiest person in town, or their name is on a school, or whatever we have, it doesn't matter. Because Nebuchadnezzar put his name on 9 out of 10 stones in Babylon. And we know that because we dug it up from the rubble of Babylon. Everything you and I have is going away. Christ is coming back and He wins. And I know I'm getting a little bit repetitive, so I'll stop here. But if that's true, we know He's always going to be with us. When we sing Another in the Fire, we have a comfort that no matter what we face this week, because some of us are going through it, some of us are on vacation, and they're going to watch us online and be like, oh, hey, that was a relaxing trip. But no matter what your week is like, no matter what your month is like, no matter what happens to our country in the coming years, what are we waiting for? If we're waiting until Jesus comes back, it's going to be like the Israelites and Judeans who sat back and said, oh, we were waiting for God to do something impressive, and He did, and we were just waiting. So let's pray, let's worship Him, and be encouraged that His grace is sufficient for all of us, that nothing we have done can separate us from us. So let's act on faith in Him. Dear Father in heaven, for those of us that need to weep this morning as this child is doing because we are going through it, for those of us that are stuck at home, that are on a wonderful vacation, no matter where we are this morning, Lord, as a church family, please allow us to see that these 3 men did nothing except say, you are God, and be willing to be chucked into a furnace for it. It was horrific. It was terrifying. They were probably ready to lose their wives that loved them, their children that adored them. But instead, you intervened. You stopped the most powerful regime in the world from enacting their version of twisted, broken justice. So, Lord, as we live in concern and fear for the future, with the uncertainty of November, with the doubts we have in our own minds about whether what we've done can separate us from your love, Lord, please break through these barriers in our hearts and our minds. If we're like Nebuchadnezzar, let us see, Lord, that you are finally worth trusting with everything. If we're like these three men willing to give it all, Lord, please give us the sustained power of your Spirit within us to continue doing so. But for those of us waiting for the right moment to step up and speak, Lord, let it be today that we recognize it is a daily calling from you. And let us have a hope in our failures that you are who you say you are. And as Peter experienced, no matter how many times he denied you, his grace was sufficient for you. Your grace was sufficient for him. So, Lord, we love you and we trust you. And as we sing this song together, let our voices be an encouragement to one another that no matter what our daily routine or our daily fire or our daily joy is, Lord, that it is constantly found in you. In Jesus' name, amen.